Daddy ain't shit. So stop treating him like it. Chapter 1, A Glimpse of the Past. In the heart of the concrete jungle, where the city's forgotten souls struggled to survive, lived a young boy named Damond. His eyes, filled with the wonder of innocence yet tinged with the harsh realities of life, would observe the world around him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The streets of the ghetto were both a playground and a battlefield for Damond. He was energetic and playful, his laughter ringing out as he darted between the alleyways and the broken-down buildings that made up his world. But as the sun set, those same streets would transform, bearing witness to violence, drugs, and despair. His home was no refuge from the chaos outside. His mother, bitter and worn, harbored a deep resentment towards Damond's father, a sentiment she passed on to her son with a cold, unyielding fervor. Damond's father was a phantom figure in his life, a man described with scorn and disdain by his mother, and yet, a man who would occasionally appear in their lives, if only for a fleeting moment. "What you doing there, boy?" his mother would ask, finding Damond peering out the window, eyes wide with fascination as he watched his father wander the streets. "He ain't worth your time, Damond," she would say, her voice hard and unforgiving. "Your daddy ain't shit. Remember that." Damond would nod, absorbing her words and adding them to the narrative he had been taught. His father was a junkie, a man who had abandoned them, a man who could not be trusted. Yet, despite his mother's words, Damond was confused. In the midst of all the hate she had for his dad, he would notice his father coming around from time to time. For 2 or 3 days, his mother and father would be intimate, sharing quiet moments and soft whispers. During those brief interludes, Damond would catch glimpses of something different, a connection that seemed to transcend the bitterness and anger. But then, as quickly as it had begun, it would be over, and daddy ain't shit all over again. The mixed messages were confusing for young Damond, twisting his emotions and creating a whirlpool of feelings that he struggled to understand. He loved his mother, respected her, and yet he couldn't help but be drawn to the enigmatic figure of his father. The questions would swirl in his mind, questions he dared not ask for fear of inciting his mother's wrath. His neighborhood was filled with contrasts and contradictions. Laughter would echo off graffiti-covered walls during the day as he played with friends, but come nightfall, those same walls would absorb the sounds of anger, sorrow, and hopelessness. It was a place where dreams seemed unattainable, where joy was fleeting and pain lingered long after the physical scars had healed. But amidst the grim reality of the ghetto, Damond found joy in small things. A shared candy bar with a friend, a successful game of stickball, or a rare smile from his overworked mother were enough to light up his world. These were the glimmers of hope that kept his youthful spirit alive, even as the seeds of hate for his father were being sown deep within him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Damond grew, physically and emotionally. The stories of his father, both real and imagined, continued to shape his perception of the man he was forbidden to know. He was taught lessons, some of them harsh and painful, lessons that would stay with him long after the innocence of childhood had faded. His mother's bitterness was a constant companion, a voice in his ear that reminded him daily of his father's failings. Her words were a litany of disappointment and betrayal, punctuated by those confusing moments when his father would return, and everything seemed to change. Was it all a lie? Damond would wonder, his mind aching with the weight of the question. Could his mother be wrong? Or was his father truly the man she described, a man undeserving of love and respect? He would watch his parents during those brief reconciliations, searching for clues, seeking understanding. But the answers were elusive, hidden behind a veil of adult complexity that he could not penetrate. As he grew older, Damond began to recognize the patterns, the cycles of anger and forgiveness, love and hate. It was a dance, a rhythm that played out with a predictability that was both comforting and disconcerting. He realized that his mother's bitterness was not just a simple emotion, but a part of who she was, a part of her very identity. It was a weapon she wielded, a shield she hid behind, a way to cope with a reality that was too painful to face. And yet, despite the confusion, despite the contradictions, Damond learned to navigate his world, guided by the imperfect love of his mother and haunted by the specter of his father. The ghetto was his teacher, a place where he learned to survive, where he learned to understand the complexities of human nature. It was a beginning filled with conflict and confusion, a beginning that laid the groundwork for a journey that would challenge everything Damond thought he knew about family, love, and forgiveness. A journey that would lead him to question not only his father's worth, but his own. A journey that would ultimately teach him that understanding and compassion were the keys to breaking the cycle of bitterness and hate. The stage was set, the characters in place. Damond's story was ready to unfold, a tale of a young boy's struggle to reconcile the contradictions of his life and find his own path to redemption. A tale that would reveal the power of forgiveness, the strength of love, and the possibility of hope, even in the darkest corners of the human soul. Chapter 2: Seeds of Hate. The first time Damond witnessed his father's weakness, he was barely 10 years old. He had heard countless stories of his father's former strength, a man who had once been filled with pride and energy. The tales had painted a picture of a man who had commanded respect in a tough neighborhood. But the father he saw was a mere shadow of that man, reduced to a pitiful state, both mentally and physically, consumed by drug addiction. The contrast between the vivid stories and the real man standing before him confused Damond. He wanted desperately to see his father as a hero, as someone he could look up to and emulate. But all he could see was frailty, vulnerability, and shame. His mother's bitterness towards his father was no secret. "Your daddy ain't shit," she would often say, her voice dripping with contempt. These words echoed in Damond's mind every time he looked at his father. The hatred had been sown early in Damond's life, nurtured by his mother's scorn and his father's failure to rise above his circumstances. Damond could see the pain in his father's eyes. The shame was evident, not only for his current condition, but also for the wrongs he had done. There was a moment when his father had stolen money from Damond, desperate to feed his addiction. The betrayal had stung Damond to the core, further fueling his resentment. But the thing that haunted Damond the most was the unspoken wish that he harbored deep within his heart. He wanted his father to do better. He wanted to see the man inside his father that the stories had described. He wanted to believe that his father's strength was a part of him too. And yet, he could not admit this longing to anyone, not even to himself. To admit it would mean to acknowledge a vulnerability that he had learned to despise. As the years passed, the image of his father's weakness became etched in Damond's mind. The neighborhood would often speak of how his father used to be, how he had been a man of his word, someone who paid his debts and respected others. But those days seemed long gone, and all that remained was a broken man. The transformation in his father, from a strong and resilient individual to a man crippled by addiction, seemed to Damond like a cautionary tale. His mother's strength and mental fortitude only emphasized his father's decline. The contrast between them was stark, and Damond found himself gravitating towards his mother's viewpoint, embracing her bitterness as his own. Occasionally, there would be a respite. His father would come around, and for 2 or 3 days, things would seem almost normal. Damond would see his parents being intimate, a temporary peace settling over their troubled household. But inevitably, the familiar pattern would return, and "Daddy ain't shit" would become the refrain once more. The love-hate relationship between his parents left Damond bewildered. It added layers of complexity to his already conflicted emotions towards his father. He was torn between wanting to love his father and being unable to forgive his weaknesses. The more he saw his father's failings, the more the seeds of hate grew within him. He began to question the lessons he had learned from his father. The values of respect, paying debts, and not lying about others were overshadowed by the man's current condition. It was a struggle to reconcile the two sides of his father, the man he had once been, and the man he had become. As Damond grew older, he realized that his resentment towards his father had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully understood. It had instilled in him a determination not to end up like his father. It had made him vow never to appear weak or vulnerable. It had taught him to value strength above all else, even if it meant suppressing his true feelings. And yet, there remained a part of him that yearned for a connection, a desire to understand the man his father had once been, and to find a reflection of that man within himself. The conflict between what he wanted to feel and what he had been taught to feel was a constant battle, one that would continue to shape Damond's perceptions and choices for years to come. In the midst of all the hate, confusion, and longing, one thing was clear to Damond: he would never allow himself to become like his father. He would strive to be better, to be strong, to be a man of his word. But deep down, the complexity of his relationship with his father would always remain, a haunting reminder of the power of perception, influence, and the fragile nature of human strength.